Tonight on Brian Ross Investigates, new trouble for USA Swimming. As the sport prepares for next summer's Olympics, the governing body is under criminal investigation for an alleged cover-up of sex abuse by its coaches. Its top official has refused to answer our questions. And asked under oath, Tim Hinchey admitted he had never even read the USA Swimming Code of Conduct.
As you sit here today, have you ever reviewed in its entirety USA Swimming's Code of Conduct?
I have not.
And conceded he has little understanding of how sexual predators groom their young victims.
I'm just not familiar with all the examples of grooming.
We're joined by former Olympic swimming star Nancy Hogshead Mocker. Plus the latest on President Trump's tax returns. What is it he doesn't want investigators to see? Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David K. Johnston has the answer. And our shout-out for the Detroit reporter who was the first journalist to understand just how serious the FBI investigation of the United Auto Workers could be.
It's a big story in Detroit, and we've been staying on top of it for 2 years plus.
From the Law&Crime Network studios in New York City's Herald Square, this is Brian Ross Investigates. Good evening and welcome. Tonight, new developments in a story that continues to suggest something very wrong with one of America's premier sports organizations, USA Swimming, which oversees some 3,000 local clubs with more than 350,000 young Americans, many of whom share the dream of one day winning Olympic gold for their country. No sport has banned more coaches and staff for sexually abusing young athletes than USA Swimming. Yet new evidence reveals that the person who runs the USA Swimming organization professes a surprising ignorance about some of the basic background and most important warning signs that could help protect young swimmers from sexual predators.
Can you think of any other national governing body which has banned proportionally, by way of percentage, more members than USA Swimming for sexual misconduct?
Again, I don't know what those numbers would be.
Timothy Hinchey is the CEO and president of USA Swimming, and this is a video of sworn testimony he gave in a court case in which he and his sport are accused of covering up sexual abuse. He was questioned by Robert Allard, a lawyer bringing the lawsuit.
Would you agree that part of keeping the children in USA Swimming safe means doing your best to protect them from child molesters?
Yes.
You would agree, sir, that child molestation is a serious thing, true?
Yes.
The lawsuit involves the now-closed swim club in Stockton, California, where the head swim coach, Sunichi Fujishima, pleaded guilty to the rape and sexual molestation of a young swimmer, beginning when she was 12 years old. The coach was found to have insidiously gained her confidence over time, what is known as grooming.
Do you know enough about grooming, sir, that it takes place over time?
I'm not familiar with how grooming takes place.
And when Hinchey was shown training material produced by U.S. Swimming itself, laying out the warning signs that predators can display in grooming victims, Hinchey admitted he had never ever read it in the 3 years he has run USA Swimming.
This is information which is disseminated by USA Swimming as part of its training program, is it not?
I have not read it before.
Have you ever assessed whether or not pedophiles are particularly attracted to the sport of swimming?
I have not.
Again and again, Hinchey admitted his lack of knowledge about the subject.
I'm just not familiar with all the examples of grooming. Again, I don't have the expertise to answer that. I just don't have the expertise as it relates to identifying what grooming is.
Before I read this information to you, had you been previously made aware of this information?
Not that I'm reading today.
And Hinchey admitted he was even unfamiliar with the USA Swimming Code of Conduct.
At any point in time, did you receive any type of training on USA Swimming's Code of Conduct?
I did not.
As you sit here today, have you ever reviewed in its entirety USA Swimming's Code of Conduct?
I have not.
USA Swimming says it relies on a so-called safe sport program designed to teach athletes and their parents what to look for as warning signs of grooming behavior. When Hinchey testified before Congress earlier this year, he made much of the Safe Sport program.
We have a number of new initiatives underway, and we are vetting even more. The Safe Sport Recognized Club program will enhance athlete protection efforts at all levels, especially the local level. While we cannot change the past, we will learn from it, and we will do better. Our commitment to preventing child sexual abuse and providing a safe and healthy environment for our athletes is constant and long-lasting.
But our investigation found only a tiny percentage of the 3,000 swim clubs around the country had actually been certified in the Safe Sport program. And when we tried to ask Hinchey about it at a fundraiser last year, he walked away, refusing to answer our questions.
Can you tell me right now how many?
I'm not going to speak right now. But
why not? Why can't you talk?
Because I'm here hosting people.
I know, but these are important questions. Sir, how many recognized safe sport clubs exist today? Can you answer that question, sir?
In his deposition testimony, the attorney read Hinchey a section of a report prepared for USA Swimming about the lack of Safe Sport program participation.
As of this writing, only 0.5% of the children in USA Swimming have taken the Safe Sport program, period, unquote. Do you see that?
I do.
Are you aware of any other figures which have been calculated since the time that this document was authored in 2014?
I don't know what the figures are.
Would you agree that the percentage of 0.5% is totally unacceptable?
After an objection by his lawyer off microphone, Hinchey finally answered.
Yeah, it's not good.
And then the attorney pushed Hinchey to respond to the fact that the Stockton Swim Club, where his client was molested, had no Safe Sport coordinator, no training of parents, no training of children.
Are you aware of any monitoring compliance program within USA Swimming implemented in the last several years which ensures that members of clubs such as the Stockton Swim Club are properly trained on Safe Sport materials?
I'm not aware of any.
So there could potentially be hundreds of clubs out there right now with the same level of a so-called protection system as Stockton, but you would have no idea about that. Fair?
He waits for an objection and then answers.
I would rely on our Safe Sport team to know what the actual numbers are and how they monitor it.
Whatever the numbers are, USA Swimming clearly did not protect the young woman who Alid represents from the Stockton Club.
Do you believe that my client was provided with a safe and healthy environment for her to grow, play, and compete?
Again, off mic, the USA Swimming lawyer quickly objected, but then allowed Hinchey to answer.
I'm not sure.
We got no response to our request for a comment from USA Swimming, as has been their practice since we first began to report the story. But joining us now is Nancy Hogshead Makar, who won 3 gold medals and 1 silver in the 1984 Summer Olympics and is now an outspoken advocate on behalf of young athletes, swimmers who've been abused by their coaches. Nancy, what is your reaction to the answers given by CEO Tim Hinchey, his answers and his non-answers?
I think it's appalling. Other than Michael Phelps and, Simone Manuel, I don't think that there's any bigger story dealing with swimming than all the coaches that they've had that have been sexually abused. His predecessor, Chuck Wildgus, was kept out of the Hall of Fame specifically because how poorly he dealt with the issue of sexual abuse.
And here's Hinchey, the new man who hasn't even read the Code of Conduct, is not familiar with many of the terms involving grooming of young athletes, which is a key, of course, to preventing this kind of sexual abuse of the young swimmers.
I would think as a leader of an organization, you would at least want him, he should at least know what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, and be able to be conversant with these terms about what's appropriate boundaries and what is grooming behavior, things like that. Because he's going to get questions on, hey, this happened. And for him not to know is stunning.
Nancy, a question for you from our control room from executive producer Rhonda Schwartz. Rhonda, what's your question?
Nancy, do you think there's something in the culture at USA Swimming that seems to be preventing this situation improving? What do you say about that?
Yeah, there definitely is something in the culture because every athlete, every parent, everybody in United States swimming should know, starting at age 7, that coaches shall not have romantic and sexual relationships with the athletes they coach, regardless of age or consent. They should know that it is off limits for a coach to try to institute any kind of relationship with somebody that they're coaching. Um, in swimming, you have a lot of marriages that happen when athletes are very young, 18, 19, 20. So it's not criminal conduct, but that culture grooms the whole sport to think that it's okay for a coach to pick their romantic and sexual partner from within the athletes that they coach. And they're not willing to say what I said about, right? They're not willing to make it well known to everyone that there is this bright line rule.
Nancy, as the Wall Street Journal has reported, there's now a criminal investigation of USA Swimming, a number of lawsuits now pending going on in California and North Carolina. Is that what it's going to take to stop this?
You know, you would think that the harm that's done to these children would be enough. But maybe when there is some criminal, not just investigations, but some criminal sentences handed down, maybe that will make swimming perk up their ears and notice.
But at this point, you would say for young people who are part of USA Swimming, there still are not enough protections in your view?
Yeah, your average family doesn't know what to ask a coach, how to hire a coach, how to establish boundaries, how to prevent grooming. It's not that hard.
Indeed. Well, Nancy Hogshead-Makar, thank you for joining us very much.
Thank you for taking this story seriously. I appreciate it.
You bet. Up next, President Trump and his income tax returns. What is he hiding? We'll talk to the Pulitzer Prize-winning author who may know the answer when we come back. Back now to try to answer the question of why President Trump is working so hard to keep his income tax returns hidden. As a candidate, he was the first in decades not to voluntarily make them public, claiming he couldn't do so because he was being audited.
I will absolutely give my return, but I'm being audited now for 2 or 3 years, so I can't do it until the audit is finished, obviously, and I think people would understand that.
But the returns never were turned over, and now the president is waging a fierce legal battle to keep them from being turned over to Congress or to District Attorney in Manhattan, Cy Vance, who's investigating whether Mr. Trump or his Trump organization broke the law when it paid hush money to 2 women to keep them from talking about their relationship with him. Joining us now is someone who has a keen insight into what's happening and why. David K. Johnston, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of the book, The Making of Donald Trump. David, thanks for joining us. What is the president afraid of in these returns, do you think?
Well, first and foremost, he's afraid that everyone's going to discover that his claims of being a billionaire are nonsense. He's a wealthy man, but he's in the tens of millions or hundreds of millions class, not a, as he's claimed, 10-plus billionaire. But more importantly, Donald has a long history of tax cheating. He had 2 income tax fraud trials over his 1984 tax returns, which weren't held until the 1990s. And in one of those cases, something really extraordinary happened. The judge, in one case, handed the tax return that had been submitted to the government to Donald Trump's and his father's longtime tax lawyer and accountant, who's since retired. And Jack Mitnick testified, "That's my signature, but I and my firm did not prepare that tax return." And one of the reasons Donald Trump doesn't want Cy Vance to get his hands on the more recent tax returns prepared by the Mazars accounting firm, I think there's a very good chance that what he submitted to the government doesn't line up with what was prepared by his accountants.
So you reveal in your book that he actually falsified his returns using the name of his accountant, but putting in his own numbers?
He used a photocopy machine to put the accountant's name onto the tax return. My very first big investigation 45 years ago was about exactly that, somebody who used a photocopy machine to put somebody else's name on documents. And that's one of a lot of reasons Donald needs to be worried. My former newspaper, the New York Times, a year ago did a 14,000-word investigation in which I could not find a single flaw, not even a technical one about accounting or taxes or economics. And the Times didn't pussyfoot around. They said flat out, Donald Trump has committed tax crimes. And when the judicial authorities began to investigate his sister, Judge Marianne Trump Berry, on the federal bench, she resigned. And unlike you and me and the people listening, where an investigation would continue, the judges have a nice little rule for themselves. Once she resigns, they no longer look into her conduct.
The president's lawyers have argued that Mr. Vance has no business getting those tax returns. It's going to go to the Supreme Court, it now seems, after the Second Circuit said Vance should have them. What do you think the Supreme Court's going to rule?
Well, I think the Supreme Court will not take the case. Donald doesn't have any claim here. It's been the law since Thomas Jefferson that a president can't fight a subpoena in this way. The subpoena, by the way, has nothing to do with his presidency. It is for business records and tax returns before he took office. If the Supreme Court does take the case, I think it will be solely for the purpose of writing an opinion that slaps down Trump's assertions that he is exempt, even as his lawyers said in this case, from a criminal inquiry were he to shoot someone on Fifth Avenue.
And you think then the Cy Vance investigation here in Manhattan could in fact be a real threat to President Trump, perhaps after he leaves office?
Oh, I think it's a very significant threat. I think there's a high likelihood it will result in a criminal charge, and if not, certainly in civil actions over his taxes. Remember, Cy Vance has access to his state returns, and in New York, your state return is virtually identical to your federal return. And given Donald's long history of faking documents, losing documents, taking the same circumstances and reporting them in radically different ways to two different government agencies, to think that Donald Trump's tax returns is clean would be naive in the extreme.
David K. Johnson, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Fascinating insights.
Thank you.
Up next, our shout out for the journalist who has led the way in reporting on the scandal at the United Auto Workers, the UAW, whose president has now taken a leave after being implicated in a bribery allegation. Back now with our shout out tonight for a reporter whose work we first highlighted earlier this year and has been staying on a story he broke: the bribery and kickback scandals at one of the country's most powerful and important unions, the United Auto Workers, the UAW. And now the union president, Gary Jones, has unexpectedly taken a paid leave as he was implicated, although not yet charged, in a $700,000 bribery scheme. And leading the way in breaking the story, as he has from the beginning, Robert Snell of the Detroit News. Detroit is a union town, and the annual Labor Day Parade is a big event. But the news coverage this year was driven by the revelation that the city's most powerful union leader, Gary Jones, the president of the United Auto Workers, the UAW, is the subject of an FBI investigation of alleged corruption. A story broken by Robert Snell of the Detroit News.
There were protesters, union workers protesting, decrying the reports of corruption that have come out of federal court. Gary Jones marched for part of the parade, declined comment to reporters on the scene, and left before the parade was finished.
Snell, who covers the federal courts for the Detroit News, first started working on the UAW corruption story some 2 years ago.
Yeah, there's a lot of outrage in some circles. The workers fear that this is confirmation of what they've suspected, that some UAW leaders might just be out for themselves and not for the average blue-collar worker.
So far, 9 people have been convicted, the latest this week in federal court in Detroit. The union has sought to portray the convictions as not that significant.
I mean, I think we're fairly well-sourced with people close to the investigation, and there hasn't been a challenging of any of the facts. What they have tried to focus reporters on is that this is merely a few bad apples who have been charged and convicted, and that this doesn't represent a broader crisis for the UAW.
But this past week, Snell and his colleagues Brianna Noble and Ian Thibodeau broke the story that the union president himself, Jones, was part of the investigation, with exclusive coverage of an FBI raid on Jones's home.
During the search, the investigators had left the garage door open at Gary Jones' home, and one of the neighbors across the street who was watching this dramatic federal search unfold grabbed his binoculars and could see agents in the garage with the open garage door counting what this neighbor described as wads of cash, really sort of a dramatic description of what was unfolding on the scene.
Today, federal agents descended on the homes of some top officials with one of the nation's largest unions.
The raid on the home of the UAW president was picked up by news organizations across the country who had pretty much ignored the story until now.
Today, FBI special agents searching inside the Canton, Michigan home of UAW President Gary Jones.
It's been somewhat of a lonely beat. Once we broke the news that the FBI and IRS and Labor Department were investigating and searching multiple locations around the country, the coverage mushroomed. You started to see the financial wires and pretty much every major newspaper, Wall Street Journal, start to weigh in and cover the developments from last week.
The allegations are reminiscent of the blatant corruption at the Teamsters Union, something I covered in my early days as an NBC News correspondent.
Rabbi Rudolph Rosenthal characterized Burns.
Except now, there are a lot fewer reporters assigned to cover such stories.
It's tough in the newspaper industry with fewer resources, but thankfully my editors have stayed committed to the story for over 2 years. So it's a matter of what we're going to devote resources to, and this is, like you said, a union town. It's a big story in Detroit, and we've been staying on top of it for 2 years plus.
And there's more to come, you think?
For sure, definitely.
So a shout out for Robert Snell and his colleagues at the Detroit News for staying on the story, which clearly is far from over. That's our program for tonight. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you back here next week. Good night.